The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window of the Martinez household, casting golden streaks across the pale blue walls. David Martinez stood at the counter, nursing his third cup of coffee, his mind already racing through the tasks of the day ahead. It was Saturday, 9:47 a.m., a day that should have been ordinary, yard work, maybe a trip to the grocery store with his wife Sarah, perhaps taking his 3-year-old daughter Emma to the park in the afternoon. The weekend stretched before him with the promise of simple pleasures and family time. David was a man of routine and modest ambitions. At 38 years old, he worked as a contract electrician, steady work that paid the bills and allowed his family to own a small but comfortable home in the quiet suburb of Ohio. He'd never been in serious trouble. His worst offense as a teenager had been a speeding ticket. He was the kind of man who waved at neighbors, helped elderly misses with her garden, and always returned his library books on time. But that Saturday morning, everything would change. The trouble had been building for weeks, though David had tried to ignore it. His neighbor, Robert, lived 3 houses down on Maple Street, had moved in 6 months earlier, and from day one, he'd been difficult. He complained about David's dog barking. He objected to David parking his work truck in his own driveway, claiming it lowered the neighborhood aesthetic. He'd called the homeowners association about the height of David's grass twice. Each complaint was minor individually, but collectively, they formed a pattern of hostility that was impossible to ignore. Then came the fence. The property line between the 2 homes had always been a bit ambiguous. When David purchased the house 8 years ago, the fence had already been there, installed by the previous owner. David had always assumed the fence was positioned correctly, that it demarcated the true property line. But 3 weeks ago, Robert had hired a surveyor, and the results had been explosive. According to the survey, the fence was off by approximately 3 feet. 3 feet of land was on David's side of the fence. It was a genuine property dispute, the kind that could be settled through lawyers and legal proceedings. David had actually been reasonable about it, calling a lawyer and preparing to follow proper legal channels to resolve the matter. Robert had other ideas. On this particular Saturday, David was in the backyard, adjusting the lawn sprinkler system when he heard an angry voice from the other side of the fence. "Martinez, Martinez, get out here." It was his voice dripping with fury. David's stomach tightened. He set down his tools and walked toward the fence, where he could see his red face peering over the wooden slats. "We need to talk about this property line situation," snarled, his accent thickening with his agitation. "I want that fence moved by Monday, or I'm filing a lawsuit. You've been stealing my land, and I'm not going to stand for it anymore." David tried to remain calm. "Mister, I've contacted a lawyer. We can work through this properly." "I don't care about lawyers," interrupted, his voice reaching a fever pitch. "You're a thief. You knew that fence was on my property and you did nothing. You let months go by stealing my land." "That's not fair," David replied, his own voice rising despite his attempts at restraint. "I didn't know about any survey discrepancy, and I'm trying to handle this appropriately." But wasn't listening. He was already moving toward the back gate, his face contorted with rage. David watched, confused and increasingly alarmed, as his neighbor opened the gate and stormed into his backyard. In that moment, David realized this wasn't going to be a civilized conversation. "You think you can just take what's mine?" shouted, advancing toward David. His fists were clenched, his body language unmistakably aggressive. "You think you can steal from people and get away with it?" David backed away, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Mister, please, let's talk about this calmly. My daughter is inside." "I don't care about your daughter," spat. "I care about my property. You're a thief and a liar." The situation spiraled rapidly. Continued advancing, his voice growing louder and more unhinged. David, still trying to defuse the situation, kept backing away. Was smaller than David, perhaps 5 inches shorter and about 30 pounds lighter, but he was operating on pure adrenaline and rage. while David was desperately trying not to escalate the conflict. "Get off my property," David said firmly, still maintaining a non-aggressive posture. "I'm calling the police if you don't leave." "Go ahead," screamed. "Call them. I'll tell them you assaulted me. I'll tell them you attacked me on my own property." Inside the house, Sarah heard the commotion and moved to the window, her heart immediately beginning to race. She saw David in the backyard, backing away from their neighbor. Emma, coloring at the kitchen table, looked up. "Mommy, why is the man yelling?" she asked, her small voice uncertain and frightened. "It's okay, baby," Sarah said, though her voice trembled. She moved toward the back door, pulling it open just as the situation reached its critical point. Had made a sudden lunge toward David, his fist raised. David, reacting on instinct rather than aggression, pushed back. It wasn't a punch, more a forceful shove meant to create distance and prevent from striking him. Stumbled backward, tripping over a garden hose, and fell hard onto the lawn. But as he fell, he scraped his arm against the edge of a decorative rock in David's garden, leaving a deep gash. The fall itself was humiliating and painful, and immediately began shouting. "You assaulted me. You attacked me. I'm calling the police." Sarah rushed out, pulling Emma with her. "David, what happened?" she cried, seeing on the ground his arm bleeding. "He attacked me," David explained quickly, still in shock. "I just pushed him back. He fell." But was already on his feet, clutching his arm, his face a mask of fury and something else, triumph. He'd gotten what he wanted. He had an injury. He had a story. "I'm calling the police right now," he announced, already pulling out his phone from his pocket. Within 15 minutes, sirens wailed down Maple Street. 2 police cruisers pulled up, their lights flashing red and blue. Officers emerged, their hands resting on their belts. Then came a third vehicle, a K9 unit. The dog, a massive German shepherd with alert, intelligent eyes, climbed out with its handler, Lieutenant Gary. David tried to explain his side of the story, but the officers seemed more interested in his visible injuries. His arm was bleeding significantly. His face was flushed and contorted with manufactured distress. He told the officers that David had attacked him without provocation, that he'd been discussing a property matter when David had become enraged and assaulted him. Emma watched from her mother's arms as the officers approached her father. She didn't understand what was happening, only that something was very wrong. She could see the fear in her mother's eyes, the shock and confusion on her father's face. "Put your hands behind your head," one officer commanded. "Wait, you don't understand," David began, but the officers weren't interested in understanding. They were following protocol, responding to an injury complaint. The German shepherd circled nearby, adding to the chaos and intimidation of the moment. Within minutes, David Martinez was handcuffed. The cold metal bit into his wrists as he was read his rights. As he was being placed into the back of the police car, he locked eyes with his daughter. Emma's bottom lip began to tremble. Her tiny hand reached out toward her father, and she began to cry, a heartbreaking wail that would haunt David for the rest of his life. "Daddy," she screamed. "Daddy, where are you going?" "It's okay, sweetheart," he called back, his voice breaking. "Daddy will be back soon." But he didn't know if that was true. As the police car pulled away from the curb, David sat in the back seat, shocked and terrified, realizing that his ordinary life had just become extraordinarily complicated. Robert watched from the sidewalk, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, his arm still bleeding but his spirit victorious. Nobody questioned what had really happened. Nobody cared about David's side of the story, not yet anyway. All they saw was an injury, a complaint, and a man who needed to be arrested. The machinery of justice, once set in motion, was difficult to stop. The county courthouse loomed before Sarah Martinez like a monument to her worst fears. Its gray stone facade seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, casting an ominous shadow across the parking lot where she sat in her Civic, gathering the courage to go inside. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Beside her, Emma sat in her car seat, clutching a stuffed rabbit named Mr. Whiskers, her small face pressed against the window. She didn't understand why they were here. She didn't understand that her father had been arrested on aggravated assault charges. To her, Daddy had simply disappeared, and Mommy had been sad ever since. 3 weeks had passed since that Saturday. 3 weeks of phone calls from lawyers, meetings with social services, and sleepless nights filled with anxiety that gnawed at Sarah's chest like a living thing. She'd taken leave from her job as a medical office administrator. They'd been understanding, but she knew her position wasn't guaranteed. Bills were piling up. David's truck sat idle in the driveway, a constant reminder of his absence. Their savings account was being depleted by legal fees. A public defender named Washington had been assigned to David's case, a young man who seemed competent but overwhelmed, juggling dozens of cases in an already overburdened system. Sarah took a deep breath and unbuckled Emma from her car seat. "Okay, baby, we're going to see Daddy's lawyer today. Remember what Mommy said. We're going to sit quietly and listen to the grown-ups talk." Emma looked up at her mother with solemn eyes that seemed too old for a 3-year-old. "When is Daddy coming home?" she asked, the same question she'd asked every single day since his arrest. Sarah's throat tightened. "Soon, baby, I hope very soon." But she didn't believe it. Not really. Deep down in the place where mothers harbor their darkest fears, Sarah was terrified that David wasn't coming home at all. The courthouse corridors were a maze of institutional beige and worn linoleum flooring. Sarah navigated through the hallways, Emma's hand in hers, following signs toward the courtroom where David's preliminary hearing was scheduled. She passed other families. Some looked hopeful, others looked devastated. She wondered what crimes their loved ones had committed. She wondered if any of them were innocent like David. Washington was waiting for her outside the courtroom. He was in his mid-30s, with kind eyes and the exhausted expression of someone carrying too many burdens. He wore a wrinkled tie and a sport coat that had seen better days. Despite his tired appearance, he radiated a genuine concern that made Sarah's heart ache with gratitude and desperation in equal measure. "Mrs. Martinez, good you're here," he said, pulling her aside into a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom. Emma immediately went to a corner to play with some toys someone had left behind. "I want to prepare you for what's about to happen in there. The prosecutor is going to present the state's case. They're going to paint your husband in a very negative light. They're going to show photographs of the injuries. It's going to be difficult to listen to, but you need to remain composed. The jury will be watching the gallery as much as they watch the witnesses." "But he didn't do it," Sarah said, her voice rising in desperation. "David would never. He's not a violent man. Everyone who knows him will tell you that." "I believe you," said gently, and Sarah could see that he meant it. "But belief isn't enough in a courtroom. We need evidence. We need facts. Right now, the prosecutor has a narrative that's easy to follow. Your husband had a dispute with his neighbor, things escalated, and your husband attacked him. The injuries support this narrative." "But what about the fact that David was defending himself?" Sarah demanded. "Came into our yard. He was the one being aggressive." "I know," said, "and we'll argue that, but the prosecution has the advantage of having a clear injury narrative. Went to the police first, filed the complaint. He established himself as the victim before David's side of the story could be heard." Paused, choosing his words carefully. "I want to be honest with you, Mrs. Martinez. This is going to be a difficult case. The prosecutor, Vincent Torres, is known for being aggressive and effective. He's already started building a case that suggests your husband has a pattern of aggressive behavior. He's going to use this trial to establish a narrative that makes your husband look dangerous." Sarah felt her world tilting. What about Emma? Will she have to testify? "Ideally, no," said firmly. "She's 3 years old. Any testimony from her would likely be inadmissible anyway. The trauma of putting her on a witness stand would be significant. We'll try to keep her out of this as much as possible." But Sarah knew that was already impossible. Emma had already witnessed the arrest. She'd already seen her father taken away by police. She was already traumatized. The preliminary hearing was a blur of legal terminology and procedural motions. The prosecutor, Vincent Torres, was exactly as had described, sharp, articulate, and ruthlessly effective. He presented police reports, photographs of injuries, and the testimony of the responding officers. In Torres' narrative, David became a monster. A man so consumed by rage over a property line dispute that he'd brutally attacked an innocent neighbor, injuring him so severely that he required medical attention. Sarah watched the jury's faces harden with each piece of evidence presented. She watched them recoil from the photographs of injuries. She could read their minds. This man is dangerous. This man is exactly the type of person society needs to protect itself from. David sat at the defense table, looking smaller than Sarah had ever seen him. He wore a gray suit borrowed from because his own clothes had been deemed inappropriate. He looked like a prisoner playing dress-up, trying unsuccessfully to appear respectable and non-threatening. When it was turn to present, he was competent but clearly outmatched. He cross-examined the officers, trying to establish reasonable doubt about what had actually happened. He questioned the timeline. He asked about demeanor, but Torres had done his work too well. The narrative was established, and attempts to dismantle it felt like throwing pebbles at a fortress. After the hearing, pulled Sarah aside again. "The judge is going to order David held over for trial," he said quietly. "She'll set bail, but I want to warn you, it might be higher than you can afford." "How much?" Sarah asked, dreading the answer. "I'd estimate somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000, said. "I'll ask for a reduction based on his ties to the community and lack of prior record, but Torres will argue that he's a flight risk or a danger to the community." The bail was set at $75,000. Sarah's heart sank. She couldn't afford that. Even with the bail bondsman taking a percentage, she'd need to put up significant collateral. She'd already mortgaged their future with legal fees. She didn't have anything left to give. That's when the social services worker approached her. Her name was, and she carried a folder stuffed with documents, was professional but had the sympathetic expression of someone delivering bad news. "Mrs. Martinez, I need to discuss Emma's situation with you," said, gesturing toward the hallway away from David. "Given that your husband has been charged with a violent crime and is currently incarcerated, we're required to conduct an investigation into the home environment and Emma's safety." Sarah's blood ran cold. "You think David would hurt Emma? That's insane. He loves his daughter more than anything." "I'm not saying he would," replied. "But procedure requires us to assess the situation. We'll need to conduct home visits. We may need to interview Emma. Depending on what we find, it's possible that the state might need to intervene to ensure Emma's safety and well-being." The implication hung in the air like a guillotine blade suspended above Sarah's head. They might take Emma away. That night Sarah sat in her empty house, Emma asleep upstairs, and stared at the walls. Her husband was in jail. Her daughter might be taken from her. Her savings were depleted. Her job was in jeopardy. She had no idea how to navigate the legal system. She felt utterly, completely alone. She called, "Is there any way David can get out on bail?" she asked desperately. "Let me work on it," he said. "I'll file another motion. But Mrs. Martinez, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that your husband might spend significant time in custody before trial." After she hung up, Sarah held her phone in her trembling hands and began to cry, deep, body-racking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere primal and terrified. Her family was falling apart, and she didn't know how to stop it. Washington sat alone in his cramped office on the 4th floor of the public defender's building, the fluorescent lights humming their monotonous song above his head. His desk was a landscape of case files, legal briefs, and photographs. The visual representation of 8 years defending people's society had already deemed guilty. The walls were bare except for a law degree from Ohio State and a faded photograph of with his wife, taken before the job had consumed his life like a malignant tumor consuming healthy flesh. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night. Hadn't been home since early morning. His wife Jennifer had called twice. He'd sent her a text message. "Working late, don't wait up." She'd stopped responding to those messages months ago. She understood, or at least she was learning to understand, that being married to a public defender meant accepting emotional abandonment as collateral damage of the profession. Pulled the Martinez file toward him for what felt like the 100th time that week. The case was a disaster, a legal catastrophe waiting to happen. He'd been assigned David Martinez 3 weeks ago, and in that time he'd come to believe absolutely in his client's innocence. David was a good man, genuinely good, not good. He'd wept in their first meeting not for himself, but for his daughter, worried about how his incarceration was affecting her. That kind of genuine concern was rare in his line of work. Most clients were primarily concerned with minimizing their own suffering. But belief in innocence wasn't a legal defense. It wasn't admissible evidence. It wouldn't sway a jury that had already seen photographs of Robert's mangled arm and heard the prosecution's carefully constructed narrative of brutality. Opened his laptop and pulled up the police reports for the 100th time. He'd memorized them, could probably recite them in his sleep. Officer James had been the first responder. Officer had assisted. Lieutenant Gary had brought the K-9 unit. The reports were all professional, all by the book, but they were also frustratingly vague about crucial details. The security camera footage from the neighboring house was supposed to help, but it was useless, grainy, distorted, impossible to definitively determine what was happening in the frame. Had watched it until his eyes burned, trying to find something, anything that would support David's version of events. But the footage was ambiguous enough to support either narrative. That was the problem. In the law, ambiguity usually favored the prosecution. The burden of proof was on the state, yes, but juries didn't think in terms of burdens. They thought in terms of stories, and the prosecution had a story while had confusion. He pulled up the medical report from his injuries. The lacerations on his arm were severe, deep, multiple, in a pattern that suggested violent striking. But they could also have been caused by falling onto the decorative rocks in David's garden, as David had claimed. Except the prosecution argued that the injuries were too severe to have resulted from a simple fall. The prosecution's expert witness had already provided a preliminary statement, suggesting that the injuries were more consistent with repeated striking by a fist or blunt object. Leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. He was missing something. There had to be something he was missing. In 8 years of public defense work, had learned that truth was almost never straightforward. It was buried beneath layers of he said, she said, corrupted by memory and bias, twisted by interpretations and angles. But truth existed, and his job was to find it. He pulled out his phone and called David, who was housed at the county detention facility awaiting trial. It was almost midnight, but had the private number for the detention center's night supervisor. After some bureaucratic maneuvering, he was connected to David in the visitation phones area. "David, I know it's late, but I need to ask you some more questions about that day." David's voice came through the phone, smaller and more defeated than it had been during their last in-person meeting. "Of course, whatever you need." "Walk me through the moment came into your yard. Every detail, every word he said, everything you remember." David had already told him this story multiple times, but had learned that repeated questioning sometimes yielded new details, little threads that when pulled could unravel an entire case. "He was angry," David said slowly, remembering. "Absolutely enraged. He kept talking about stolen land, about me being a thief. He said he was going to sue me, that I'd been deliberately deceiving him." "What about physically?" pressed. "Describe his body language. Was he threatening? Did he make gestures that seemed violent?" Yes, David said, his voice growing more animated. His fists were clenched. He was advancing toward me. When I told him to leave, he lunged. It wasn't a punch exactly, more like he was rushing at me, trying to tackle me or something. I pushed back. I was defending myself. I was terrified. I thought he was going to hurt me. Made notes. This detail was crucial. David wasn't just passively being attacked. He was in genuine fear. That suggested self-defense more convincingly than his previous statements had. Did anyone else see this? Asked, besides Emma and Sarah. I don't know, David said. There were neighbors around. Someone might have seen. I was too focused on what was happening to notice. His mind raced. Witness statements. He needed to interview neighbors. Most of them had probably already been interviewed by police, but what had they told the officers? More importantly, what had they not told the officers? After the call, sat in the darkness of his office, illuminated only by the glow of his laptop screen. He pulled up the case file again and reviewed the police interview summaries. 3 neighbors had been interviewed. Mrs., who lived directly next door to David, Thomas Weber, who lived 2 houses down, and Susan Caldwell, who lived across the street. Mrs. Statement said she heard raised voices, but hadn't witnessed the actual physical altercation. Thomas Weber hadn't been home. Susan Caldwell's statement was vague. She'd heard commotion and had seen police cars, but hadn't seen the actual incident. But here's what troubled. The police reports didn't mention anyone specifically saying that David had initiated the assault. They documented his claims, but there was no statement from any officer saying. Multiple witnesses confirmed that David Martinez attacked Robert. The absence of corroborating witness statements was itself significant. If the incident had been as clear-cut as the prosecution claimed, wouldn't there be at least one neighbor who'd come forward to confirm story? Printed out the neighbor contact information and made a note to interview each of them personally. Maybe they'd seen something the police hadn't specifically asked about. Maybe they'd noticed aggressive body language. Maybe they'd seen him lunge at David. Maybe they'd seen the fall. He pulled up the police report about the K-9 unit and read it again. K-9 unit responded to scene. Dog secured after apprehension of suspect. That was it. One sentence. But why had the K-9 unit been necessary for a residential assault call? That seemed excessive. Made another note. Request detailed incident report on K-9 deployment. The clock on his wall showed 2:33 a.m. Knew he should go home. He knew his marriage was hanging by a thread. He knew his health was suffering. His doctor had warned him about his blood pressure at his last checkup. His cholesterol was high. He wasn't sleeping enough. He was drinking too much coffee, too much alcohol. But he couldn't stop. Not yet. Not when innocent people were counting on him. Stood up and walked to the small window that overlooked the parking lot. The city lights twinkled in the distance. Somewhere out there, Robert was probably sleeping peacefully, confident that his enemy would be locked away for years. Somewhere in the county jail, David Martinez was probably awake, worried about his family, wondering if his public defender was actually working on his case or if he'd been written off as another guilty poor man. And somewhere in a small house on Maple Street, Sarah was probably lying awake, staring at the ceiling, terrified that her daughter would be taken from her, that her husband would be convicted, that her life would never be normal again. Returned to his desk and began drafting interview questions for the neighbors. He was exhausted, but he was also determined. Something didn't add up. The case didn't make sense. And in his 8 years of experience, when something didn't make sense, it usually meant the truth was hiding somewhere underneath the official narrative. He had no idea yet what that truth was, but he was going to find it, even if it took him all night, even if it destroyed his marriage, even if it cost him his sanity. Because David Martinez deserved that. Everyone deserved that. The courtroom was a study in controlled chaos on the morning of the status hearing. The calendars of multiple cases were being addressed simultaneously, creating a constant shuffle of lawyers, defendants, and families moving through the space like chess pieces on an invisible board. Sarah sat in the gallery with Emma perched beside her, coloring quietly with the box of crayons the bailiff had provided during one of their previous visits. The bailiff, an older man named with a surprisingly gentle demeanor for someone who worked in such a harsh environment, had taken pity on the little girl during their first appearance. Now, he always made sure there were crayons and blank paper available whenever Sarah brought Emma to court. Emma was coloring with intense concentration, her small tongue poking out of the corner of her mouth as she worked. Sarah watched her daughter, seeing the toll this process was taking even on someone so young. Emma's drawings had changed since David's arrest. Where once she'd drawn bright suns and smiling stick figures, her recent artwork had become darker, clouds, rain, and increasingly, images of people separated from each other by barriers or walls. Today's drawing was different. Emma had drawn a figure with a distinctive shape, something tall and four-legged, with a long tail and pointed ears. Next to the animal was a stick figure wearing what Emma had attempted to indicate as a uniform, with a badge drawn as a simple circle on the figure's chest. "That's pretty," a soft voice said from beside Sarah. She looked up to see Jennifer, the court-appointed child advocate who'd been assigned to monitor Emma's welfare throughout the proceedings. Jennifer was in her late 40s, with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent years navigating the trauma of children caught in legal systems. She wore business-casual clothes and carried a tablet, though Sarah noticed Jennifer spent more time observing than documenting. "Thank you," Sarah said, turning back to Emma. "She's been drawing a lot lately." Jennifer knelt down beside Emma, her face at the child's level. "That's a pretty doggy," she said softly, pointing at the animal in the drawing. "Do you like doggies?" Emma looked up at Jennifer, then back at her drawing. For a moment, Sarah thought her daughter might not respond. She'd become increasingly withdrawn over the past few weeks. But then Emma spoke, her small voice barely above a whisper. "The police doggy," Emma said simply. "He was there." Sarah felt her heart skip. She looked at Jennifer, unsure what her daughter meant. The police dog had been present during David's arrest, but Emma had been inside the house at that point, wasn't she? Or had she seen it through a window? Sarah couldn't remember the exact sequence of events from that chaotic Saturday morning. "That's interesting," Jennifer said, still speaking in the gentle tone she used with Emma. "Do you remember the police doggy?" Emma nodded, returning her attention to her coloring. She added more details to the dog figure, a longer tail, more defined teeth in what she intended to be the animal's mouth. Jennifer stood up and exchanged a glance with Sarah, who shrugged, equally puzzled. Jennifer made a note on her tablet, though Sarah couldn't see what she'd written. The hearing continued, and Sarah's attention was drawn away by the judge's voice addressing about the trial date. It was being scheduled for 6 weeks out, giving both sides time to prepare. Looked tired, his eyes carrying the weight of too many sleepless nights. He'd been to the Martinez home twice now, and both times Sarah had noticed the growing frustration in his demeanor, as if he was looking for something he couldn't quite find. After the hearing concluded, Jennifer approached in the hallway outside the courtroom as attorneys and defendants dispersed. Sarah watched from a distance, keeping Emma close, curious about what the child advocate might be discussing with the defense attorney. "I'm probably overthinking this," Jennifer said, falling into step beside him, "but I noticed something during the hearing today." Who'd been reviewing his notes looked up. "What's that?" Emma was drawing and she drew a picture of a police dog. I asked her about it and she said, "The police doggy was there." It seemed like a significant memory for her, though I'm not entirely sure what it means. I thought you should know, given that your investigation might benefit from understanding what the child witnessed. Paused mid-stride. His initial reaction was dismissive. The ramblings of a 3-year-old weren't evidence. Children's memories were notoriously unreliable, and their drawings were even less reliable. But something in Jennifer's tone, her genuine concern, made him hesitate before dismissing it entirely. "Thanks for mentioning it," he said, tucking the information away in his mental file. It might be useful background. That night lay in bed next to his wife Jennifer, a different Jennifer, his wife of 6 years, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't sleep. The image of Emma's drawing kept running through his mind. A police dog. The K-9 unit had been there, that was documented. But why? For a residential property dispute that had turned physical, did police really need a K-9 unit? He got out of bed quietly, trying not to wake his wife, and went to his home office. He pulled up the Martinez case file on his laptop and began reading through the police reports again, but this time with a specific focus on the K-9 unit's involvement. The incident report from Officer James stated, upon arrival at scene, discovered suspect in backyard with visible injuries to upper body. Victim present with lacerations to left arm and face. Given the potential for continued violence, K-9 unit was called to assist with securing the scene. That was the official explanation, but it felt thin too. Why would police anticipate continued violence at a residential assault scene? If the assault had already happened, why would a police dog be needed? Unless there was something about the situation that suggested ongoing danger or threat. Continued scrolling through the documents until he found the K-9 unit incident report, filed by Lieutenant Gary. It was brief and perfunctory. K-9 unit arrived at scene at approximately 10:34 a.m. Dog was deployed due to suspect's refusal to comply with initial instructions and potential threat to officer safety. Suspect was secured without incident. K-9 remained on scene during investigation for officer protection. Incident concluded at approximately 10:52 a.m. Read it again. Suspect's refusal to comply and potential threat to officer safety. But according to David's statement, he'd been cooperative. He'd explained what happened. He'd pushed back against attack, and when police arrived, he'd attempted to explain the situation. Made a note. Request detailed video of arrest and K-9 deployment. He also pulled up the medical report on Robert's injuries again. The prosecution's expert had concluded that the injuries were consistent with repeated blunt force trauma from fists. But what if they weren't? What if there was another explanation that the prosecution hadn't considered because they'd already committed to their narrative? Emma's drawing of the police dog suddenly seemed less like a child's random sketch and more like a memory, a significant memory. The next morning, called the detention center and requested an urgent meeting with David. This time, when he visited, he came with very specific questions. David, when the police arrived, did they approach you with the dog immediately? David thought about it, his face scrunched in concentration as he traveled back in his mind to that terrible Saturday. Yes, the officer with the dog came to where I was standing. I remember being nervous. I'd never been that close to such a large dog before. What did the dog do? Nothing really, David said. It just stood there, looked at me. But then, he paused, remembering more clearly now, then it started sniffing in the direction of, and the officer, the one with the dog, he seemed surprised by something. He said something too and moved away from the dog. His instincts suddenly fired to life. He felt that electric tingle that he'd learned to recognize over the years, the sensation of truth emerging from beneath layers of confusion. What did the officer say to? I don't remember exactly, David said, struggling with the memory. It was all happening so fast, but I remember thinking it was strange that the officer seemed more concerned about than about me. That evening, sat in his office with a fresh cup of coffee, going through the police reports once more with new eyes. He was looking for something specific now, any mention of the dog's behavior toward either David or any incident report about the dog's actions. And there, buried in the appendix of the K-9 unit's supplementary report, he found it. One sentence in an addendum filed by Lieutenant. K-9 engaged suspect during apprehension. Minor injuries sustained. Minor injuries sustained. Read it again. It didn't specify who had sustained injuries or from what cause. The language was deliberately vague, almost as if someone had intentionally buried this detail beneath layers of bureaucratic obfuscation. Leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. What if Robert's injuries weren't from David's fists at all? What if they came from the police dog? What if the real story was completely different from the one the prosecution had constructed? He pulled out his phone and stared at Emma's drawing in his mind. That simple stick figure with a badge and a dog with prominent teeth. A 3-year-old had seen something crucial, and somehow, in all the chaos and confusion and official reports, that something had been missed, or worse, deliberately obscured. Made a decision. Tomorrow, he would request the full video of the arrest. He would demand to know exactly what the K-9 unit had done during David's apprehension. He would file motions. He would subpoena witnesses. He would tear apart the prosecution's case brick by brick. But tonight, he sat alone in his office with the nascent beginnings of hope, the fragile, tentative hope that perhaps, just perhaps, he'd found the thread that could unravel everything. Washington paced the length of his cramped office like a caged animal, his phone pressed to his ear, listening to his supervisor's exasperated voice on the other end of the line. It was 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, and had barely slept. He'd spent the night drafting the motion in his head, rehearsing arguments, anticipating objections. Now, in the gray light of early morning, he was running the idea past his supervisor, knowing full well how insane it would sound. "Let me get this straight," his supervisor, Robert Hayes, said, his tone dripping with skepticism. "You want to file a motion to have a 3-year-old child present in the courtroom during cross-examination of a police officer in a violent felony case. A 3-year-old who is also a witness, potentially, in this same case. A 3-year-old whose testimony is inadmissible. A 3-year-old whose presence could traumatize her further and potentially contaminate the proceedings. Is that what you're telling me?" "Yes," said simply. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." "I like you," Robert continued, and could hear the weariness in his voice. "I think you're a good attorney, but this is insane. This is the kind of motion that gets judges angry. This is the kind of motion that makes us look like we've run out of legitimate legal arguments. The judge is going to deny it, and then Torres is going to use it as evidence that you're desperate and grasping at straws." "Maybe I am desperate," acknowledged. "Maybe I am grasping at straws, but I've got nothing else, Robert. The prosecution's case is solid. Their narrative is compelling. The physical evidence supports their version of events. I need something that breaks the case open. I need to shake things loose." Robert was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly, becoming less dismissive and more resigned. "What's your actual legal theory here? Walk me through it." Took a breath and explained. He detailed his investigation into the K-9 unit's incident report, the single-sentence addendum about the dog engaging the suspect and sustaining injuries. He described Emma's drawing and her spontaneous comment about the police dog. He outlined his theory that Robert's injuries might not have come from David's fists but from the police dog's teeth, and that if a 3-year-old's presence in the courtroom could trigger the police officer's recollection or create some kind of reaction that revealed the truth, then it might be worth the risk. "That's speculation," Robert said, but his tone had changed. He sounded almost interested now. "You don't have evidence of that. You don't have the dog bite analysis. You don't have medical evidence supporting this theory." "Not yet," agreed. "But if I can get the officer to crack, if I can get him to admit something on the stand that I can then follow up on, I can request an emergency continuance to obtain the evidence I need." Robert sighed heavily. "This is a long shot, a very long shot." "I know," said, "but right now, the longest shot seems like the only shot I've got." After ending the call, didn't wait for official permission. He immediately began drafting the motion. He worked methodically, carefully constructing his legal arguments. He cited cases about witness presence in courtrooms. He argued that while Emma would not be testifying, her presence might serve as a tool for refreshing the police officer's recollection regarding the specific details of the K-9 unit's actions during the arrest. He framed it as a motion to investigate possible exculpatory evidence that had been overlooked. He knew it was a thin argument. He knew Judge Caldwell would likely see through it. But he also knew that judges were human beings, and human beings sometimes took chances on unusual motions if they sensed genuine injustice might be occurring. By 8:00 a.m. the motion was drafted. By 8:30 a.m. it was filed with the court. By 9:00 a.m. had called Sarah. "I'm filing an unusual motion," he told her, explaining as clearly as he could what he was trying to do. "I'm requesting that Emma be present during cross-examination of the police officer. She won't be testifying, but her presence might help trigger important details." "Will Emma be traumatized?" Sarah asked immediately, her protective instincts overriding everything else. "Possibly," said honestly. "I won't lie to you, Mrs. Martinez. This is risky, but I believe Emma might have witnessed something crucial, something that could prove your husband's innocence. And I think having her present in the courtroom during the officer's testimony might unlock that information." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "If you believe it will help David, then do it. I'll do whatever it takes, whatever it takes." That afternoon, visited David in the county detention facility to prepare him for what was about to happen. "I'm filing a motion that's unconventional," said carefully, explaining his theory and his plan. He watched David's face cycle through confusion, hope, and then doubt. "Emma," David said, his voice shaking, "you want to bring Emma into that courtroom. I don't know if that's—" "I know it's unconventional," interrupted. "I know it sounds crazy, but David, I need you to trust me. I think your daughter saw something that day, something that could prove your innocence. And I think having her present might help unlock that information from the police officer's testimony." David's eyes filled with tears. "If you think it will help, then yes. Yes, do it. I trust you." 2 days later, Torres responded to the motion with a scathing reply brief. He argued that introducing a traumatized child into a courtroom setting was improper, potentially prejudicial, and would serve no legitimate legal purpose. He suggested that the defense was resorting to emotional manipulation of the jurors through the presence of a sympathetic child. He called the motion a transparent attempt to distract the court and jury from the overwhelming evidence of the defendant's guilt. Judge Caldwell scheduled oral arguments on the motion for the following Monday. That Monday morning, stood before the judge, his heart hammering in his chest. He'd prepared extensively, but he knew how absurd his position sounded. He was asking a judge to allow a 3-year-old child into a courtroom to potentially refresh a police officer's recollection about the K-9 unit's actions during an arrest. It sounded insane when he articulated it aloud. "Your Honor," he began, "I understand this motion is unconventional, but I believe there is exculpatory evidence that may have been overlooked during the investigation, evidence that relates to the specific actions of the K-9 unit during Mr. Martinez's apprehension. The child in question was present during the events in question and may possess relevant observational information that could assist the court in determining the accuracy of the police officer's testimony." Torres stood and delivered a blistering rebuttal, characterizing the motion as desperate and emotionally manipulative. Judge Caldwell listened to both arguments carefully, her expression unreadable. She asked several probing questions about his legal theory and found himself being more and more honest about how speculative his position was. "Mr. Washington," the judge said finally, "I'm going to allow this motion, but I'm doing so with significant reservations. The presence of the child will be carefully controlled. She will not be questioned. She will not testify. She will simply be present. If at any point I determine that her presence is unduly prejudicial or traumatizing to the child, I will remove her immediately. Is that understood?" "Yes, Your Honor," said, hardly believing what he was hearing. "Thank you, Your Honor." As he left the courtroom, Torres cornered him in the hallway. "You're making a mistake," the prosecutor said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're going to traumatize that child for nothing. The jury isn't going to acquit your client because of some stunt with his daughter." Didn't respond. He couldn't afford to let doubt creep in now. He'd made his move. He'd crossed the Rubicon. Now all he could do was hope that his theory was correct, that Emma had seen something significant, and that somehow a 3-year-old's presence in a courtroom would unlock the truth. That night lay awake again, but this time the sleeplessness wasn't caused by worry. It was caused by something resembling hope. He'd filed a motion so unconventional that it bordered on professional suicide. If it didn't work, if the judge determined he'd wasted the court's time, there could be consequences for his career. But if it worked, if Emma's presence triggered the officer's memory, if the truth about the K-9 unit's actions emerged, then David Martinez would walk free and justice would be served. It was a desperate gambit, perhaps the most desperate gambit of his career. But sometimes, desperation was the only tool available to those fighting on behalf of the innocent. The courtroom fell silent as the trial resumed on a cold November morning. The jury filed back in after a break, taking their assigned seats with the practiced monotony of people who'd been sitting in the same chairs for days. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Word had spread through the courthouse about the unusual motion the judge had approved, something about a child's presence being required for the defense's case. Reporters filled the gallery. Camera operators stationed themselves strategically around the room. This was the kind of human interest story that sold newspapers and generated clicks. Judge Caldwell entered from her chambers, her black robes flowing behind her like the wings of a dark bird. She surveyed the courtroom with an expression that was difficult to read, somewhere between curiosity and concern. She took her seat at the bench and looked directly at Washington. "Mr. Washington, you may proceed with your request regarding the child's presence." Stood, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. This was it, the moment that would either vindicate his instincts or destroy his career. He turned to face the gallery where Sarah sat, Emma clutching Mr. Whiskers against her chest. Sarah's face was pale, her hands trembling slightly. She'd barely slept the night before, her mind cycling through scenarios both hopeful and catastrophic. "Mrs. Martinez," said gently, walking toward the gallery, "could you please bring Emma forward?" Sarah took a deep breath and unbuckled Emma from her seat. She whispered something to her daughter, words of encouragement and love, then stood, holding Emma's hand. They walked together down the center aisle of the courtroom, and every eye in the room followed their progress. Emma was wearing a pale pink dress that Sarah had chosen carefully, wanting her to look innocent and vulnerable, but also presentable. The 3-year-old moved slowly, her small legs struggling with the length of the aisle, her grip on her mother's hand becoming as she sensed the weight of attention focusing on her. The prosecutor, Vincent Torres, watched with an expression of barely concealed contempt. He'd filed objections to this moment, argued vehemently against it, and now he was witnessing it anyway. He believed this was a grandstanding move, an emotional manipulation designed to sway jurors. His jaw was clenched so tightly that Sarah could see the muscles working beneath his skin. Judge Caldwell leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Martinez, you may stand with Emma at the side of the witness stand, but she is to remain silent. She will not be questioned. She is simply to observe. Understood?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah said softly. Lieutenant Gary sat rigid in the witness stand, his uniform perfectly pressed, his demeanor that of a man trained to maintain composure under any circumstance. But noticed the slight widening of his eyes when Emma and Sarah entered the courtroom. For just a fraction of a second, something flashed across the officer's face, recognition, perhaps, or concern. Sarah and Emma positioned themselves at the side of the courtroom, directly across from where the police dog was stationed. The dog was part of the courtroom's regular security detail, a massive German shepherd with alert, intelligent eyes. The animal wore a working vest, indicating it was on duty. Its handler, a different officer than stood nearby, maintaining control of the leash. For several minutes, the courtroom proceedings continued. Began his cross-examination of Lieutenant, asking detailed questions about the arrest procedures, the deployment of the K-9 unit, and the timeline of events. Answered with the practiced precision of a police officer who dozens of times before. He was comfortable on the stand. He was confident. He appeared to be a man who had nothing to hide. But then Emma moved. Until that moment, she'd been mostly still, confused and overwhelmed by the size and formality of the courtroom. But now her eyes found the police dog. She stared at it, and something shifted in her expression. Her small body went rigid. Her hand, which had been loosely holding her mother's, suddenly gripped it tightly. "Baby," Sarah whispered, concerned, "are you okay?" Emma didn't respond. She couldn't look away from the dog. The animal, sensing the child's gaze, tilted its head slightly, its ears perking forward with interest. The handler maintained control of the leash, but the dog's attention was fixed on Emma. Noticed the interaction and made a split-second decision. He altered his line of questioning, moving away from the timeline and toward the specifics of the K-9 unit's actions. "Lieutenant," said, his voice carefully neutral, "can you describe in detail what the K-9 unit's actions were when they arrived at the scene?" Hesitated fractionally. The dog was deployed to assist with securing the scene and ensuring officer safety. And in securing the scene, what specific actions did the dog take? Pressed. The dog was positioned near the suspect to discourage any further hostile actions, replied, his responses becoming more measured. Emma suddenly pointed at the German shepherd, her small arm extended fully, her finger trembling slightly as she indicated the animal across the courtroom. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Jurors leaned forward in their seats. Reporters scribbled frantically in their notebooks. Then Emma spoke. Her voice was small, uncertain, the voice of a child who'd been scared and traumatized but was finally finding words to describe what she'd witnessed. 2 words, just 2 words. "He bit." The courtroom erupted. The words hung in the air like a grenade that had just detonated. Judge Caldwell's eyes widened. Jurors exchanged shocked glances. The prosecutor's face flushed red with anger and something else, the sudden realization that something significant had just occurred. Sarah gasped, pulling Emma closer, realizing the magnitude of what her daughter had just said. David, sitting at the defense table, looked as though he'd been struck by lightning. "He bit," Emma repeated, more insistently this time, still pointing at the dog. "The doggy bit the man, he bit him." Judge Caldwell pounded her gavel. "Order, order in the courtroom." She looked directly at Sarah. "Mrs. Martinez, you need to remove the child from the courtroom immediately." But before Sarah could move, spoke, his voice urgent but controlled. "Your Honor, I respectfully request a brief recess to address the statement that's just been made." Torres was already on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is exactly the kind of emotional manipulation I warned against. The child's statement is inadmissible hearsay, not based on reliable memory and clearly prejudicial." "I'm aware of the issues, Mr. Torres," Judge Caldwell said sharply. "The statement is indeed inadmissible as testimony. However, it may constitute grounds for the defense to request additional discovery regarding the K-9 unit's involvement in the arrest." She turned to the jury. "You are instructed to disregard the child's statement. It is not evidence in this case. You will not consider it in your deliberations. You are excused for a 15-minute recess." The jurors filed out, some of them glancing back at Emma with expressions of sympathy and curiosity. Emma, still held by her mother, watched them go, not fully understanding the magnitude of what she just said, only that everyone was looking at her and that her mother was trembling. Wasted no time. Before the judge could leave the bench, he filed an emergency motion to compel the production of all incident reports, medical evaluations, and video evidence related to the K-9 unit's actions during David Martinez's arrest. He cited Emma's statement, not as testimony, but as grounds for believing that exculpatory evidence had been or improperly investigated. Torres objected vehemently, but the damage had been done. Judge Caldwell, visibly intrigued despite her judicial neutrality, granted the motion. Mr. Torres, you are to produce all K-9 unit incident reports and any related medical documentation within 24 hours. Mr. Washington, you will have 48 hours to review these materials. We will reconvene on Friday morning to discuss what, if anything, this new information reveals. As Sarah carried Emma out of the courtroom, David caught his daughter's eye. Emma, confused and overwhelmed, reached out toward her father. David reached back, their fingertips nearly touching across the distance that separated them. It was a moment of profound connection, a father and daughter separated by a legal system that had nearly destroyed them both. Stood at the defense table, his mind racing. 2 words from a 3-year-old had just cracked open the entire case. He bit. Those 2 words had introduced the possibility, no, the likelihood, that everything the prosecution had presented as fact was actually a lie built on incomplete information. Now, for the first time since taking this case, allowed himself to believe that David Martinez might actually walk free. The 24-hour deadline set by Judge Caldwell transformed the prosecutor's office into a frantic search operation. Somewhere in their filing system, buried beneath layers of procedural documentation and police reports, lay the evidence that would either confirm or destroy Washington's theory. Vincent Torres worked through the night with his assistants, pulling files, cross-referencing incident reports, and searching the digital database for any K-9 unit documentation related to David Martinez's arrest. What they found made Torres' blood run cold. The evidence had been there all along, filed properly, documented correctly, but never synthesized into the larger narrative of the case. A supplementary incident report from Lieutenant Gary detailed the K-9 unit's engagement with Robert during the apprehension. The dog, a German shepherd named Kaiser, had been deployed when had allegedly attempted to flee the scene. Kaiser had tackled, and during the ensuing struggle, the dog had bitten his left arm and face, causing significant lacerations. The medical report attached to this documentation was even more damning. The injuries to his arm showed a distinctive bite pattern consistent with canine dentition. The depth of the lacerations, the spacing between puncture wounds, the tearing pattern of the tissue, all of it matched a dog bite far more closely than injuries from human fists. An emergency room physician had even noted in his initial assessment, injuries appear consistent with animal bite. Recommend animal control evaluation. But somewhere in the chain of communication, this critical information had been lost. The medical report had been filed under his name in the hospital system. The K-9 incident report had been filed with the police department's K-9 unit records. Neither document had made it into the formal discovery package sent to the defense. It wasn't necessarily intentional misconduct. It was systematic failure, bureaucratic incompetence, the inevitable consequence of information existing in multiple filing systems that didn't communicate with each other. Torres sat in his office at midnight, staring at the documents spread before him, understanding with crystalline clarity that his entire case had been built on a foundation of incomplete information. He could argue that the defense should have found this documentation themselves. He could claim that the police department was responsible for discovery, not his office. But the truth was more uncomfortable. He'd failed to conduct a thorough enough investigation. He'd accepted the police narrative without sufficient scrutiny. He'd built a case against David Martinez based on incomplete information. By 7:00 a.m. Friday morning, Torres had no choice but to inform Judge Caldwell that the requested documentation would be provided immediately. He sent the files electronically to his office with a curt email. Attached, are the K-9 unit incident reports and associated medical documentation. We request that the court consider these documents in their proper context. Proper context. Torres was essentially asking the judge to explain away evidence that contradicted his entire prosecution. Received the files at 7:15 a.m. and immediately began reading them. His hands started shaking as the implications became clear. Medical photographs showed injuries in detail, puncture wounds in a distinctive pattern, tissue damage consistent with teeth, swelling and bruising characteristic of an animal bite. The K-9 incident report was unambiguous. Kaiser had engaged the suspect during apprehension, and injuries had resulted. Called David immediately. David, I have the evidence. The injuries that the prosecution said you caused, they came from the police dog. There's medical documentation, incident reports, everything. You're going to be acquitted. David wept on the other end of the phone line, his voice breaking as the weight of injustice began to lift from his shoulders. Thank you, he kept saying. Thank you, thank you, thank you. At 9:00 a.m., the courtroom reconvened. Judge Caldwell reviewed the new documentation with an expression that grew increasingly stern. She looked directly at Torres. Mr. Torres, did your office have access to these documents during the initial investigation and prosecution preparation? Torres stood, his face flushed with a combination of embarrassment and anger. Your Honor, these documents were filed separately by different agencies. While technically discoverable, they were not part of the primary prosecution file. The responsibility for discovery falls primarily with the police department. The responsibility for discovery, Judge Caldwell interrupted sharply, falls with the prosecution office. You represent the state, Mr. Torres. That means you are responsible for ensuring that all relevant evidence is discovered and disclosed. These documents fundamentally alter the evidentiary landscape of this case. She turned to Mr. Washington. I assume you wish to present evidence based on these newly discovered documents. Yes, Your Honor, said, barely containing his elation. I would like to request that Lieutenant be recalled for additional cross-examination regarding the K-9 unit's specific actions during Mr. Martinez's apprehension. Torres objected, but his objections were perfunctory, the death throes of a case that was already dead. Judge Caldwell overruled him and ordered to be recalled. When Lieutenant returned to the witness stand, something had shifted in his demeanor. The confidence was gone, replaced by a wary tension. He'd been informed of the newly discovered documents during a recess. He knew what was coming. Approached him with the medical photographs in hand. Lieutenant, I'm showing you these photographs of Mr. Roberts' injuries. Are you familiar with these injuries? His jaw clenched. I am. These injuries were documented as consistent with a canine bite pattern, correct? The emergency room physician noted that possibility, yes. It's not a possibility, Lieutenant, said, his voice sharp. It's a medical fact. These injuries came from Kaiser's teeth, not from David Martinez's fists. You were there. You know what happened. I'm asking you directly, did Robert injuries come from Kaiser? Looked at the judge as if seeking rescue. Finding none, he slumped slightly in the witness stand. Yes, he said quietly. Was fleeing the scene. He was resisting apprehension. Kaiser tackled him, and yes, there was a bite. And the report you filed indicated this, continued. Yet this critical information was never provided to the defense. Why? I filed the report, said defensively. It's not my job to ensure the prosecution receives every piece of information I file. Actually, Judge Caldwell interjected, it is the police department's responsibility to ensure that all relevant evidence reaches the prosecution for discovery purposes. Returned to the defense table and presented additional evidence, the medical expert's assessment, the forensic analysis of the bite pattern. With each piece of evidence, the prosecution's case crumbled further. The narrative that had seemed so solid, so compelling just days ago, was revealed to be fundamentally false. Torres rose for final argument, and his voice had lost its characteristic sharpness. Your Honor, while there is ambiguity regarding the exact source of Mr.'s injuries, that does not necessarily prove Mr. Martinez's innocence of the assault charge. Mr. Martinez did engage in physical contact with Mr. Sit down, Mr. Torres, Judge Caldwell said coldly. I've heard enough. Based on this newly discovered evidence, which fundamentally undermines the state's case, I am declaring a mistrial. Furthermore, given the prosecution's failure to adequately investigate and discover evidence that contradicts their primary narrative, I am recommending that the state's Bar Association review this office's handling of discovery obligations. She turned to David. Mr. Martinez, you are hereby acquitted of all charges related to this incident. You are free to go. The courtroom erupted. Sarah screamed with joy, Emma in her arms. David broke down, tears streaming down his face. Journalists rushed toward the courtroom doors to report the stunning reversal, stood at the defense table, barely able to believe what had just happened. As David was unshackled and removed from the defendant's box, he walked directly to Sarah and Emma. He wrapped his arms around both of them, holding them as if he might never let go. Emma, still not fully understanding what had happened, simply held onto her daddy, asking, "You're coming home now?" "Yes, baby," David whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Daddy's coming home now." Judge Caldwell looked over the courtroom from her bench, her expression grave. She spoke to the gallery. This case represents a catastrophic failure in our system of justice. Incomplete information, inadequate investigation, and insufficient disclosure of evidence nearly resulted in an innocent man spending years in prison. This must never happen again. She looked directly at Torres. "Mr. Torres, your office will be subject to a Bar Association inquiry. I'm recommending a complete review of your discovery practices and a mandatory training program on prosecutorial ethics and the rule." As the courtroom emptied, stood alone for a moment, processing what had occurred. A 3-year-old's 2 words had unraveled an entire case. Truth, buried beneath layers of bureaucratic incompetence, had finally emerged. Justice, delayed and nearly destroyed, had ultimately prevailed. It was imperfect justice, because David Martinez had still spent 3 weeks in jail, still faced the trauma and stigma of arrest, still had his family torn apart. But it was justice nonetheless. Gathered his files and walked out of the courtroom, knowing that this case would change his career forever. He'd proven that sometimes, the most unexpected witnesses, a frightened 3-year-old who'd simply spoken what she'd seen, could illuminate truths that seemed impossibly buried. The parking lot outside the county courthouse was pandemonium. News vans with satellite dishes lined the perimeter. Reporters with microphones jostled for position. Camera flashes erupted like fireworks as David Martinez emerged from the courthouse with Sarah at his side and Emma in his arms. The 3-year-old, confused by the sudden chaos and attention, buried her face in her father's neck. "Mr. Martinez, how does it feel to be acquitted?" a reporter shouted. "Mr. Martinez, do you plan to pursue legal action against the county?" David ignored the questions, walking directly to his truck, the same truck that had sat idle in his driveway for 3 weeks while he'd been in custody. He helped Sarah into the passenger seat, secured Emma in her car seat, and then sat for a moment in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel, unable to move. The reality of freedom was almost impossible to comprehend. He was going home. His family was intact. His life, though permanently altered, was no longer on the precipice of destruction. "I love you," Sarah said softly, reaching over and squeezing his hand. "I love you too," David replied, his voice hoarse. "I love both of you so much." The drive home took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. The familiar streets have seemed different somehow, as though the world had shifted on its axis while he'd been away. When David pulled into his driveway, Mrs., the elderly neighbor he'd helped with her garden countless times, was standing on her front porch. She waved, tears streaming down her face. Their friends had known him, had believed in him, even when the legal system had threatened to destroy him. That night, David tucked Emma into bed, reading her favorite story 3 times because she'd asked for it 3 times. He lingered in her doorway, watching her sleep, overwhelmed by gratitude for the daughter he'd nearly lost to the machinery of injustice. Meanwhile, at the county prosecutor's office, the internal investigation was already. Judge Caldwell's recommendation for a bar association inquiry had triggered a cascade of consequences. The Ohio Bar Association launched a formal ethics investigation into Vincent Torres and his office's handling of discovery obligations. An independent auditor was brought in to review all ongoing cases to ensure that similar discovery failures hadn't occurred in other prosecutions. What the auditor discovered was troubling. Torres' office had a pattern of incomplete discovery in multiple cases. Not necessarily intentional misconduct, but systematic negligence, files not properly cross-referenced, information stored in separate systems that didn't communicate, and insufficient oversight of the discovery process. The auditor recommended comprehensive reforms. Torres ultimately resigned from his position, accepting a settlement that included an acknowledgement of discovery failures but no admission of intentional wrongdoing. His departure sent shockwaves through the prosecutor's office. A new head prosecutor was hired with a mandate to implement systematic reforms. The new prosecutor, Mitchell, a woman with 20 years of experience in criminal law and a reputation for integrity, immediately instituted new protocols. Discovery procedures were centralized. Digital filing systems were integrated. Attorneys were required to conduct independent discovery reviews separate from police department filings. Mandatory training on prosecutorial ethics was implemented for all staff. Judge Caldwell used the Martinez case as the centerpiece of a statewide judicial conference on discovery practices. She presented the facts of the case to judges across Ohio, highlighting how systemic failures could nearly destroy innocent lives. Her presentation became required viewing for all prosecutors in the state. Universities began using the case in their criminal procedure courses as an example of how easily justice could be subverted by inadequate systems. 3 months after David's acquittal, Sarah sat in a therapist's office with Emma. Doctor specialized in childhood trauma, and she'd been working with Emma to help her process the events of the past months. Emma had suffered nightmares, regression in her toilet training, and periods of separation anxiety where she couldn't bear to let Sarah or David out of her sight. But slowly, with gentle guidance and patience, Emma began to heal. The nightmares became less frequent. Her drawings, which had been dark and frightening, gradually returned to the bright colors and smiling figures of a normal 3-year-old. She was learning, with the resilience that children possess, to move forward. "Your daughter did something remarkable," Doctor told Sarah during a parent consultation. She witnessed something traumatic, processed it in the way that children process things, and then at exactly the right moment she was able to articulate what she'd seen. That took courage, even if she didn't understand what she was doing. Sarah cried, holding her daughter's hand. She saved her father's life. "In a way, yes," Doctor agreed. But more importantly, she learned that speaking the truth matters, that what she observed, what she experienced, had value and validity. That's a powerful lesson for a child to learn, even under such difficult circumstances. David returned to his job 6 weeks after his acquittal. His employer had held his position, understanding that his arrest had been a miscarriage of justice. His welcomed him back with a warmth that surprised him. They'd believed in him when the legal system hadn't. His reputation in the community, while initially damaged by arrest and accusation, was gradually restored as the truth about the case became widely known. He and Sarah made the difficult decision to sell their house on Maple Street. They couldn't bear to live in the shadow of that property line dispute, couldn't bear to see Robert's house every day as a reminder of how quickly their lives had nearly been destroyed. They found a new house in a different neighborhood, a place without history, without trauma, where they could begin rebuilding their family life. Robert faced his own consequences. A civil lawsuit was filed against him for false accusation. Additionally, an investigation revealed that had deliberately misrepresented his injuries to the police, claiming that David had caused them when he knew, or should have known, that they'd been caused by the police dog. He settled the civil suit for a significant amount, money that David donated to the Public Defenders Association to fund legal training programs on discovery practices and prosecutorial ethics. A year after David's acquittal, Washington was invited to speak at the Ohio State Bar Association annual conference. He presented the Martinez case study to an auditorium filled with attorneys, judges, and legal professionals. He discussed the systemic failures that had nearly destroyed an innocent family. He highlighted the critical role that Emma's 2 words had played in uncovering the truth. Justice is fragile, told the assembled attorneys. It depends on systems that are often imperfect, staffed by people who are often overwhelmed, operating within structures that sometimes fail. But justice also depends on people, lawyers, judges, advocates, who are willing to challenge the narrative, who are willing to say, "This doesn't add up," who are willing to pursue truth even when it seems impossible. He paused, thinking of David Martinez in the defendant's box, thinking of Emma pointing at the police dog, thinking of the moment when truth had finally broken through layers of systematic failure. Sometimes truth comes from unexpected places. Sometimes it comes from a 3-year-old who simply speaks what she's seen. Our job as legal professionals is to make sure we're listening, really listening to those unexpected voices. 2 years after the events that had nearly destroyed them, the Martinez family gathered in their new backyard for a celebration. Emma, now 5 years old, played on the grass with other children, her laughter bright and unburdened. Sarah and David sat on the patio, watching their daughter, grateful for the simple gift of normalcy. Washington had been invited to the celebration, along with Jennifer, the child advocate whose casual observation about Emma's drawing had sparked the entire investigation. Judge Caldwell had also accepted an invitation, taking a rare departure from her judicial distance to acknowledge the family she'd helped protect. "I've been thinking about something," David said as they watched Emma play. "If you hadn't filed that motion, if you hadn't been willing to take that risk, I'd be in prison right now. An innocent man would be serving time for a crime he didn't commit. And you knew that motion was unconventional, that it could hurt your career." "I had to try," said simply. "That's all any of us can do, try to find the truth, try to do what's right even when the system seems stacked against us." Emma ran over and threw her arms around his legs. "You helped my daddy," she declared with the innocence and directness of a child. Knelt down and looked Emma in the eyes. "You helped your daddy, Emma. You were brave and you told the truth, and that made all the difference." As the sun set over their new home, casting long shadows across the backyard, the Martinez family experienced something they'd thought might be lost forever. Peace. Not the peace of ignorance or complacency, but the peace that comes from having survived injustice and emerged stronger, more aware of both the fragility and the resilience of the systems that governed their lives. The case had exposed systemic failures, but it had also demonstrated that truth, though sometimes buried, could ultimately prevail. Emma, playing in the grass as the stars began to emerge, represented hope for a future where justice might be more reliable, more fair, more worthy of the trust placed in it. The Martinez family's nightmare had ended, not because the system was perfect, but because people, a dedicated public defender, an observant child advocate, a thoughtful judge, and a 3-year-old who'd simply spoken the truth, had refused to accept injustice. In a world where so many cases fell through the cracks, they'd been fortunate enough to have people fighting for them. And though the scars would remain forever, so would the knowledge that truth, ultimately, had the power to set them free. Retry can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.